Drafting Archetypes is sponsored by Grey Viking Games. Grey Viking Games is the best place to get MTGA arena codes. From booster packs to awesome cosmetics, check them out at greyvikinggames.com and use our code DRAFT for 10% off.
Hi everyone, this is Drafting Archetypes. I'm Sam Black, and today we are going to talk about the remaining color pairs in Strixhaven. So I've already gone over all of the normal colleges, and I've talked about Dimir, which is the off-college color pair that I personally like the most, but I haven't talked about the other kind of like off-plan archetypes that you could theoretically draft. So that's what we're going to cover in this episode. And for anyone who is a limited guru or higher level patron, you can follow along with the notes now. Those are already up on patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. So to get right into it, we are going to talk about 4 different archetypes here. So I'm not going to go super deep into any of them. They're not super deep. I've drafted only some of these. I've seen all of them at least a little bit. Yeah, like these are archetypes where like even now at the absolute end of the format, 17 Lands has very, very little data about these decks because they get played so rarely. And it's correct that they get played rarely. You shouldn't play them very often, but there are coherent decks here in at least some of these color combinations. So it's good to know what you can do with them should you find yourself in a spot where that's what the draft dictates. Again, it's going to be really, really rare. I suspect, we're talking like around 1% of drafts. You should be in one of these archetypes. So that's a fraction of a percent each. For the sake of completion, I figured it was worth going over briefly what stuff exists in this space. So as far as like how do you end up in like an off-college deck? Like why would you ever be in this space? How should your drafting be different to like be open to this or whatever? I think for the most part you shouldn't be looking to, but if you think about how I've talked about staying open in some of the like kind of more multicolor archetypes, basically if you're starting by just taking the best cards without trying to be a particular college, especially if you open on some monocolored cards for flexibility, you might just coincidentally be in a seat where you take allied colored cards, and maybe you're suspecting that you're going to play a lot of colors and then you just like don't see fixing, or you keep seeing cards in those colors. I think the most likely thing that's going to put you in this space is when you start with a single color extremely powerful rare or mythic card, and a few of them support specific plans really, really well. Movinda is the mythic 2/3 flyer that lets you recast spells from your graveyard, but they cost extra if they don't target your creatures, is the best reason to draft Seleznia. And Sedgemoor Witch is kind of the best enabler for Rakdos. And like Sparring Regimen, I think actually plays super well in Azorius. And obviously these really powerful monocolored cards are also really good in their guilds. But there might be something exceptional that they do in one of these kind of like off-college decks. Alternatively, just the fact that you're starting with this really, really strong monocolored rare means you really don't want to give up that color, but it's possible that the colors that pair with it aren't open in your draft. And so when you like hold on to this rare, but draft support cards in the open color, that could lead to a situation where you just naturally end up being an allied colored pair. And that's not necessarily disastrous if you know how to take advantage of it in your position to do that. So I think that's kind of like the story on how you get here. So let's talk about what to do when you're here in the various places, wherever here happens to be. So with Azorius, I think there are like 3 kind of different like pulls toward different strategies or different kinds of decks that hypothetically exist in this space. There is the Skies deck, then there's kind of like a Prowess deck, and then there's the Spells Control deck, where you're combining the ideas from the Dimir school of thought with the white control stuff, but without all the extra colors. Which is to say, basically, you just have a bunch of like expels and rise of extuses and pop quizzes and serpentine curves and barian books and hopefully as few other commons as possible, and curate and stuff. There is at this point a little bit of data on how these decks have been played on 17 lands, and serpentine curve is a very highly played card in Azorius, but a very unsuccessful card. And my takeaway from that is that people overplay it in Azorius, which is to say that they're probably using it in decks that have a bunch of flying creatures where it's not a good fit, the same way that it often doesn't work well in Quandrix decks that have a few too many creatures for it. So I think for the most part, you do not want to play Serpentine Curve in Azorius, but it is hypothetically possible to end up in a space where you just get a whole bunch of removal and cantrips and learn cards, and that's what your deck is doing. More likely, I think you're going to be on more of the prowess, aggro / skies, and there's some overlap there kind of space. Brief aside, something that I meant to touch on for every color. Much the way that in sealed deck, if your pool's not very good, you might want to try to be aggressive so that you end the game before your opponent has a chance to take advantage of the fact that their pool is just stronger than yours, has more bombs or whatever. I think with all of the guild-specific decks, your card pool is kind of just like weaker than your opponent's on average because you don't get the powerful gold cards that exist. So I think you're in a similar space where you just want to be aggressive. I mean, that's kind of the nature of two-color decks versus more than two-color decks in this format in general, because the multicolor decks, once they get going, have access to powerful spells from all over the place, whereas the two-color decks, you want to really be pushing, taking advantage of the fact that you're not spending your mana resources, so tapped lands and playing things to fix your mana and stuff to get set up. So you want to take advantage of the extra power and consistency that you get from having untapped lands in two colors to apply pressure to your opponent. So all of these decks will generally fare better if they can lean more aggressive. So the way to be aggressive with blue and white is to prioritize, I think, largely the interaction between flying creatures, which white offers Combat Professor, but then the other flying commons are not very good. You're talking about Stonerise Spirit and Pillar Drop Rescuer. So you get your Combat Professor from white and then maybe a little bit of extra support, and then you get to pair that with Frost Trickster and Waterfall Aerialist, and the 1 mana O2 flying uncommon in blue plays really, really well here. When you start pairing, playing that thing into Guiding Voice, now you have a really good evasive early threat that's applying a lot of pressure to your opponent. And so I think the biggest thing that's going on is a bunch of flyers, more flyers potentially, or more cheap aggressive flyers than Silverquill has, debatably, depending on how you value various things. But basically, Frost Trickster is really good in the Silverquill style aggro flyers kind of strategy. So you can pair that with Guiding Voices. Thunderous Orator plays really well in this archetype because you have Frost Trickster and potentially the O2 flyer to give it flying. Waterfall Aerialist is a good place to put the counters from Enthusiastic Study or whatever due to having the ward, makes it a little harder for your opponent to answer. And then you can use Silverquill Pledge Mage as an additional flyer. It's a little bit hard to cast, but it works. You can also use Study Break as a tempo card. I will note Study Break also weirdly had pretty bad stats in this archetype on 17 lands. Don't have a great explanation for that. It might be the fact that it was being paired with Serpentine Curve and trying to be used more defensively rather than in the tempo type role. In a tempo role, it seems like it should play pretty well here, but the stats don't back up it being ideal. Eager First Year is probably the 2-drop of choice for this archetype. It doesn't have flying, but it does have prowess. You're going to be casting a lot of spells. What you really want is Thunderous Order and Professor of Symbology. Failing to get the good uncommon 2-drops, Eager First Year is the common you're going to want to lean on. And then if you have a lot of Guiding Voices, you can play Stonerise Spirit. Eager First Year will do a good job getting some damage in, getting you into a spot where you can win a race with your flyers. Yeah, that's what's going on. There can be larger and smaller, prowess packages with, like, dipping more into Quandrix Pledge Mage, which is not advisable. That card doesn't do very well in general. You can take a note from the Seleznia playbook, and you can combine Quandrix Pledge Mage with Beaming Defiance. Beaming Defiance in general is pretty solid in this archetype, especially once you're doing the like Guiding Voice Expanded Anatomy thing. Being able to protect that on a flyer is good. Pillar Drop Rescuer, I think, is actually a lot better here than it is in the white colleges. Both because you're more likely to be stretching for playables, so the fact that it's, not good enough to make those decks. Here, like, you don't have anything better, which I'm going to try to frame as a strength. But, like, really, there's not a lot of competition at 5 mana, and importantly, returning Frost Trickster in particular with Pillar Drop Rescuer is really, really strong. Obvious reasons. It gives you more Frost Tricksters, which is the primary thing that your like aggro Skies deck is about. That's kind of my quick take on what's going on with Azorius. So moving on to Seleznia. So if Azorius is similar to Silverquill in that it's evasive aggro, Seleznia is similar to Lorehold in that it's like tricks aggro. So flyers are prioritized less, combat tricks are prioritized more, and you're more likely to just be, I attack with something, my opponent blocks it, and then I play some kind of trick to give me an advantage here. Or I play a creature, my opponent plays a creature, I play Mage Duel so that my creature gets bigger and kills their creature, and I attack and push some damage. And, Heated Bait does a similar thing in Lorehold to what Mage Duel is doing in Seleznia. So as far as just like matching play patterns and maybe something about what maybe that can inform some of what you already know about which white cards you like where, Seleznia is closer in play pattern to Lorehold than it is to Silverquill. And then the reverse is true for Azorius. As I mentioned, there exists a little bit of 17 lands data about these archetypes, but not a lot. I did look into it, and I noticed some weird, just really like puzzling data quirks comparing Azorius to Seleznia. Specifically, Seleznia theoretically wins more overall. However, most of the commons, just in general, and the same common overlapping, have better win rates in Azorius than they do in Seleznia. So the deck that wins less often, the commons in it win more often, which I don't have a good explanation for outside of, I guess, maybe Seleznia is just leaning really highly on cards at higher rarities. That's my best guess, because the commons don't do well in this archetype, relatively speaking. Also, we're looking at small sample sizes here, just very much small sample sizes across the board, but the data provided by them is a little bit weird. Guiding Voice has a 2.5% higher game in hand win rate than the next best common in Seleznia, which is Professor of Zoomancy. So, like, that's a big jump between the top common and the second common, and its Guiding Voice is the absolute best in Seleznia. So, take that with a grain of salt because it's small sample size data, but also it's a big jump where Guiding Voice is way ahead of everything else. Professor of Zoomancy second, that's not terribly surprising. Zoomancy has very good stats across the board. Mage Duel is third highest, and it's 3% lower than Professor of Zoomancy. So there's a 5.5% gap between Mage Duel and Guiding Voices, which is nuts. Again, I have to mostly credit that to small sample sizes, but it really says a lot about like what data we have says Guiding Voices is absolutely critical to this archetype. And then, weirdly, Beaming Defiance and Eager Cadet are right after Mage Duel. Now, Beaming Defiance as the highlight of Seleznia isn't terribly surprising to me because I think that Seleznia is often about maximizing exactly Mavinda or Dragon's Guard Elite, and Beaming Defiance is a great way to protect one of those high rarity creatures that are really strong in the archetype. But what is kind of surprising to me is, so Beaming Defiance and Eager First Year are both ahead of Combat Professor, which is weirdly just like very, very low. Combat Professor just doesn't do well in this archetype. And then further weird data about Seleznia. The absolute worst performing card that there is a good amount of data on is Quandrix Pledge Mage. So to give you an idea of what some of these numbers that I'm working with are, Guiding Voice is around like 65% or something. Game in Hand win rate. Combat Professor, 47. Quandrix Pledge Mage, 42. So Quandrix Pledge Mage is just awful, which is really strange because, as I mentioned, this archetype is potentially drafted around Dragon's Guard Elite, but Quandrix Pledge Mage is quite a bit worse. Take what you want from that. Note, I've been a long-time advocate for not valuing 3-mana tutus very highly, and that just applies to Quandrix Pledge Mage, even in this archetype, which I think I had kind of suspected might literally be like the Quandrix Pledge Mage archetype, where it's like, okay, cool, I have Quandrix Pledge Mage and then spells to protect it. But I do think that you want to be more white-based than green-based, so the mana's awkward on Quandrix Pledge Mage. The size, like, it just starts pretty small. It doesn't line up well in the format. So I would say, even when you're in this space and you're playing all of the things that look like they should be the right support cards, maybe still don't prioritize Quandrix Pledge Mage specifically. So what does that mean you should be prioritizing? I don't know. Professor Azumancy, your first year are the creatures that do the best, so how about those? And then like whatever else you happen to find with good support spells. I think that it's kind of more about like pairing Guiding Voice with Mage Duel and, Beaming Defiance and even like Big Play Study Break, and then just cast those creatures on whatever bodies you happen to have around. But obviously, sample sizes are small there, but, because the sample sizes are small, the gaps are big, which again points to the gaps are probably exaggerated, but when the gaps are really big, it feels like it's making a, reasonable statement directionally. Anyway, that's what I was able to find there with the data, and then my just intuition about the archetype is, broadly speaking, it wants to play like aggressive Lorehold. Next up, I suppose I will touch very briefly on green-red, only to say I can't think of any reason that you should play green-red. It has the worst performing win rate of all the archetypes on 17 lands at like 44%. I think it's kind of like a bad version of Lorehold aggro and a bad version of Seleznia aggro. You're just like some ground creatures and some tricks and some removal, but like I can't find anything that seems meaningfully better than the sum of its parts. There's Enthusiastic Study that you can like pair with Big Play to like give trample plus extra pumps, but that's not particularly unique or valuable. It's unsupported. They didn't throw it a bone. I don't know why you would play green-red specifically. Little to no saving grace there as far as I'm concerned. The time when I guess I was most tempted to think about it was like when I opened Crackle with Power, and it's like, oh, if I play this and some field trips, maybe I can do a big Crackle. But like if that's what you're trying to do, just play Teamer instead. Like there's no way that you want to be like, I'm gonna ramp a bunch of mana into play and play a late game, and I don't want to include blue. Blue just offers so much to that strategy. So yeah, I really try to cover what I can about like when you're in this spot, here's how to do it, and I got nothing for Gruul. I just think it's bad. So that moves us on to Rakdos. To my mind, Rakdos revolves around pests. I think that Rakdos, like Dimir, is all about lessons and learn cards, but unlike Dimir, it is aggressive. Instead of Arcane Subtraction and Pop Quiz, you have First Day of Class and Enthusiastic Study. Those are much, much, much worse if you are a control deck, but quite a bit better if you're aggressive. And First Day of Class and Enthusiastic Study both play really well with pests. Enthusiastic Study allows you to just attack all of your pests into whatever your opponent has, use the study to kill their blocker, push some damage, learn again. First Day of Class sets up the 5-mana play of First Day into pest summoning, make 2/2 hasters, which doesn't sound all that exciting, but it's actually pretty good, especially given the flexibility of First Day of Class to just like do other stuff, just like 2-mana instant to learn to find whatever you need. Can also pair it with just like Unwilling Ingredient or Eye Twitch or something for 3 mana to just like get some value out of it. A reason this exists is first day of class and enthusiastic study both go really, really late. So if you just want, like, if you're looking to pair two colors and get as many learn cards as possible, Rakdos is a great place to do it because black gives you access to Cram Session, Hunt for Specimens, and Rise of Exodus, and then red gives you very late first day of class and enthusiastic study. So you just get to spend a lot of picks taking learn cards. And then what you want is multiple copies of Pest Summoning and Necrotic Fumes. And then also, every other lesson is going to give you more tools and it's going to be good. But the reason that I want Pest Summoning so much is that Pest Summoning will both, I think is one of the best lessons for taking advantage of first day and enthusiastic study, but it also allows you to use Village Rites and Plumb the Forbidden well. And once you have those, and ideally, like Necrotic Fumes, then you can start to do the Steel and Sack stuff with Claim the Firstborn and Mascot Exhibition, both of which are both uncommon, so there aren't a lot of them, but they both go very late, so you can realistically expect to get multiple of them in a deck. You don't want to play the Dissector or whatever, the horrible 4-drop that lets you spend mana to sacrifice things, but you don't need to. If you have a Necrotic Fumes, it gives you consistent, reliable access to a way to sacrifice your opponent's creature in a way that's very profitable. So I think that the entire Steel and Sack concept entirely revolves around drafting Necrotic Fumes. Once you have Necrotic Fumes, you can do this thing, and without it, you really shouldn't try to. But once you're there and you have the Necrotic Fumes and you're doing this, then it's also nice to be able to play the other sack outlets, Village Rites and Plumb, so that you can do the thing for less mana and so that you can not need to pair it with a learn card, and you just get more flexibility and stuff, especially in a spot where those cards can be good in your deck anyway. That's kind of like the backbone of what you're trying to do. So if your deck is based on having a whole bunch of learn cards and a bunch of pest summonings, and a lot of your learn cards cost 2 mana, like Cram and Hunt and somewhat first day of class, then you don't really want to prioritize 3 mana creatures because you're expecting to play pests on turn 3. So don't draft them. Just don't prioritize the common 3 mana creatures. You might have to play 1 or 2 if you end up with it. It's not the end of the world if you end up with a random Silver Quill or Lorehold Pledge Mage in your deck, or a Tome Shredder or whatever, but never go out of your way to take a 3 mana creature. You want to be taking 2 mana creatures, 4 mana creatures, removal spells, learn cards, even 1 mana creatures like Unwilling Ingredient, and especially Eye Twitch. Eye Twitch is great. But you mostly, this is a really, really spell-heavy deck, ideally, because you just want tons of learn cards and removal. So your expensive cards should just be removal. Mage Hunter's Onslaught, Pigment Storm, Rise of Exodus. It's okay to play Spectre of the Fens, Pillar Drop Warden, maybe even Witherbloom Pledge Mage. And then you want just cheap removal, like Lash of Malice, and then as much of the learn stuff as you can get, maybe Heated Debate, and then you want to just go I do learning, I play pests, I kill your things that block my pests well, your removal spells are bad against me because I'm just making pests. And so you end up playing an attrition game where you just play these random pests that your opponent doesn't have a good way to deal with. So they're trying to block, but their blockers don't work because your deck is full of removal because you are, Mage Hunter's Onslaught and Pigment Storm are not actually that bad in your deck. And so you just kill other creatures and grind them out. And you build up some card advantage from the stuff that your lessons are doing. Notably, Sedgemoor Witch is perfect for this archetype because you want to be spell heavy anyway, and you want pests. It does all that. It's so good in this archetype, and so obviously leads to this archetype, that more Rakdos decks on 17 lands have played Sedgemoor Witch than Eye Twitch. Eye Twitch being an uncommon that's a high priority for those decks, but despite the fact that Sedgemoor Witch is rare and Eye Twitch is uncommon, Sedgemoor Witch is so good, and it's such a high portion of the reason to end up in Rakdos that it ends up being among the more played cards in Rakdos. I think that the main things to look for in terms of okay, when can I let myself go here are Sedgemoor Witch and Necrotic Fumes. I think that this deck is kind of real. The stuff that it's doing makes sense. With this much learn, I would, always hope to find an environmental sciences, and then you can include some other colors. If you're really, really spell and removal heavy, you can splash blue for like Serpentine Curve, which plays well with your first day of class, or you can splash green for Professor of Zoomancy, maybe some other big creatures. Maybe you can start doing some Tend the Pest stuff. Maybe you can try to pull off the Mondo combo of first day of class Tend the Pests. I think Rakdos is an archetype that can splash pretty well since it is playing a more kind of controlling, really attrition, but there is like control and attrition aren't far from each other strategically. So anyway, since it's playing that kind of game and prioritizing learning, it's pretty easy to pick up environmental sciences and some fixing and do splashing and end up in a slightly alternate universe version of Dimir. Those are my quick hits on how to draft the other archetypes. So for anyone here in my audience on Twitch who has any questions, now would be a great time to ask any questions you have. While I'm waiting for that, I do want to thank my new patrons this week: Jeremy, Santiago, Patrick, Sam, and Diago. Really appreciate support on patreon.com/drafting archetypes. Let's see if there are any questions. First question is the only real reason to go into the non-supported two-color pairs specific rares. I would say that it requires a specific rare to like actively look to go into one of those archetypes, and even then it's pretty questionable. But I mean, broadly, like when you should go into these things is when for some reason it's the only thing you can find that's open. And the most likely reason that you are to get trapped into a spot where you can't find an open college is when you have gotten very attached to a single color rare that you've opened, which isn't necessarily wrong. Like, there are rares that are just worth holding on to. So that's why I think that specific rares are most likely to lead you here, where like it's kind of like there's not a good reason, really, is the answer. So if the question is like, does it take a specific rare to want to do this? The answer is you shouldn't really want to do it. It doesn't, there's not even a specific rare that makes you want to do it. It's more, this can happen to you, and it's more likely to happen to you because of making reasonable decisions based on an amount of attachment that makes sense to a really, really strong rare, like Poet's Quill or Sparring Regiment or Sedgemoor Witch or any of the other really, really strong monocolored cards. So the follow-up question is, how do you identify that it's best not to just stick to one of the like main pairs for that card? So like if you took Sedgemoor Witch, how do you identify that you're not supposed to just be Silver Quill or Witherbloom? And I think the answer is you're not presented with the opportunity to be those things. So like you are trying to be Silver Quill or Witherbloom, presumably, when you start with a Sedgemoor Witch. But if the people passing to you, if those gold cards aren't available at your table, maybe strong cards from one of them weren't opened early, or maybe just like the people in front of you are in both of them or whatever. This might be the person in front of you is just also in black, but they're taking like the good guild cards and kind of passing you the monocolored scraps. And maybe they're just passing you very few black cards, and then blue or red ends up being the open color. So you first pick a Sedgemoor Witch, and then get past like Igneous Inspiration or something, and then just start seeing like heated debates, but you don't want to get off your Sedgemoor Witch. Then you might just find yourself far enough along in these colors that you start to say like, okay, well, do I want to abandon one of these? Well, I have strong cards in both of them. Can I make this work? And then this is about like, okay, once you're in that spot where this is just what's available to you, how do you make it work? To answer the follow-up to this, yes, it is largely like the reason to be aware of these archetypes is largely about making the best of like a bad situation where you're cut off from the central colleges, because like obviously gold cards are strong and they give you a bunch of extra tools to use in the rest of the draft. So like in pack 1 you wouldn't choose to commit to an allied colored pair because there are so many fewer cards that you'll have available to you in the rest of the draft. Even if you know you're getting some synergies, it would probably be better to be in a space where just like a larger number of cards in the format are going to improve your deck. But when this is all that you can find and you are getting past good cards in it, you can make it work. So there's a reason that I say that, all of these are niche decks that you should only be in, 1% of the time collectively or something. And it is that for the most part, these aren't strategies that you want to actively pursue. This is about like when you are, getting cut off and find yourself in this spot, how do you try to like salvage something and have like a cohesive playable deck in a color pair that wasn't necessarily particularly intentionally designed to lead to cohesive decks. So this is very much, how do you make lemons out of lemonade kind of, or lemonade out of lemons kind of situation or whatever, making do with what's available rather than like, oh, well, now I should go try to draft Rakdos. I mean, of these decks, if you do like the idea of what's going on here and want to like try it out, try doing something different than you've done other drafts and stuff, I would say Azorius and Rakdos have the most coherent things going on, and you might be able to make something useful happen. There are certain key cards, like to be Rakdos, I do think you need to find a Necrotic Fumes pretty early or something, and still have other stuff in the draft like go well. You need to hope that the right uncommons are opened, stuff. The deck at least does something where it uses cards in a way that is uniquely available to that color pair. The cards are better for you than they are for anyone else at the table, which is kind of what you need to have a purpose, which is the problem with Gruul, is that there aren't cards in red or green that are uniquely suited to play with cards from the other color that give you some kind of sum that's greater than the total of its parts. And that's why I didn't, really go into like, well, what do you do here? I mean, if you're Gruul, I guess you just take the best cards that are available to you and hope it works. Whereas at least some of these other archetypes, there's a coherent plan that you can work toward. All right. Looks like there didn't happen to be a lot of questions about these ones, which is fine. Hopefully that means that I, covered what little needs to be known about these archetypes. I believe that this will actually wrap up my coverage of Strixhaven now that I've talked about all the color combinations. After finding all of the last bits to cover here, we are just now getting into Forgotten Realms previews. I don't know where we're going to be at, whether there will be anything useful to talk about there next week, but there's a good chance that this will be my last episode about Strixhaven. So if you haven't listened to the previous episodes and there are any archetypes in Strixhaven that you are curious about, you should be able to find some discussion of them somewhere in the archives here. And that is going to do it for this week. Thanks for listening, everyone, and goodbye.